So, a very good afternoon to all of you present here, and I very warmly welcome you to this second session for the day. And here, of course, as has been the case, we have three absolutely fantastic papers. One paper presenter will be joining us online, and the other two are, of course, here with us. So I think just to have enough time for discussion and things like that, I would request each presenter to present for a maximum of 25 minutes. And if you stop at 20 minutes, that would be ideal. So I think without much further ado, let's start with the first paper for the day. So it's titled Spiritual Health and Physical Health, Examples from the Crusading Period, circa 1095 to 1291. And this paper will be presented by Professor Megan Cassidy-Welch. She's from the University of Divinity, Australia. So Professor Megan, if you can hear us.
Yes, can you hear me all right in the room?
Yes, absolutely fine.
Excellent, thank you. And thank you so much, everyone, for organising this conference and for the opportunity to present this work in progress. So the Crusades were a set of Christian holy wars conducted in various locations from the end of the 11th century. The initial destination of the most of the Crusades was Jerusalem, and from 1095, streams of Crusaders embarked on long and arduous journeys, mostly from Europe to what they described as the Holy Land, now obviously modern Israel, Palestine and surrounds. Their aim was to take that land from its Muslim, Jewish and other inhabitants. Crusaders thought of themselves as soldiers, but also pilgrims, so they're quite a unique community of travellers. They were armed and they expected battle, but they had also made a spiritual oath to reach their destination and fight on behalf of God, as they thought. They were promised an eternal reward for taking this oath, and that reward was the forgiveness of their sins. And in medieval Christian theology, of course, that meant that they thought that they would be going straight to heaven should they die on a crusade. So Crusaders are therefore a very interesting group to explore when we think about health and preventive healthcare. They were a highly mobile population. Their armies included ordinary pilgrim travellers as well as soldiers, and they were invested, very much invested, in the spiritual outcomes of their journeys, both for themselves and for the wider Christian world as they understood it. So they were acting individually, but in some ways they were also acting perhaps on what we'd call a population level, if you like. So both physical and spiritual health were critical parts of their journeys and their rationale for undertaking those journeys. And you have here just an image of a crusader taking up the cross, in other words, making that promise to go on crusade, being blessed by a bishop, and a nice quote from the pontifical there from the 12th century, that the sign of the Holy Cross is a remedy to save the human race. And those who take it up or wear it, i.e. crusaders and also pilgrims, might obtain bodily health and protection for their souls. That's a nice sort of encapsulation of the crusade journey. So in this paper, I want to consider aspects of preventative healthcare as both physical and spiritual amongst crusaders and pilgrims. Physical and spiritual health, as we all know, were highly integrated in medieval religious thought. Disease and illness were sometimes understood to be evidence of God's anger and a kind of punishment for people. But sometimes disease and illness were thought to be positive signs of suffering for God, sort of evidence of somebody's strong faith. Underpinning ideas about illness and disease were highly complex theologies about the body. Medieval Christianity really was essentially corporeal. It was premised on the notion of the incarnation, the idea of the incarnation, the bodily appearance of God on earth in the body of Christ, and on the notion that Christ had suffered and died as a human, as a sacrifice that would gain Christians eternal life. It was also expressed and experienced through bodily functions like ingestion, through sort of sacraments like the Eucharist and so on, through movements like processions, and through rituals like prayer. So these are all the sorts of broad ideas, practices, and so on that crusaders and pilgrims brought with them on their travels, their cultural baggage, if you will. In the early 13th century, the medieval Western Church was also highly preoccupied with maintaining the boundaries of orthodoxy, what they thought as right religious thought. The theologians were deeply concerned by the rise of dualism, one of the features of which was the notion that the body and spirit were separate. This was heresy, according to successive popes who waged rhetorical and literal wars against supposed dualist heretics at this time. And the largest church council convened in the Middle Ages was the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. And that council came up with a number of decrees, the most famous of which was the statement that there is only one community of the faithful outside of which no one can be saved. So that sort of statement of universal faith was part of the background for the Crusading movement and its justification. So how did preventive healthcare reflect these ideas? To illustrate the combination of physical and spiritual health, I'll discuss briefly two texts that include advice for travellers, particularly crusaders, but also pilgrims, and practices of preventative healthcare that were sort of woven into these spiritual journeys. My first example is a text by an Italian cleric, Adam of Cremona, entitled On the Regimen, Way of Travelling, and End of the Pilgrimage. This is a text that was composed for the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II around 1227 Christian era for his crusade to the Holy Land. It's a text that survives only in one early 15th century manuscript, and that manuscript also contains medical and other treatises attached to the court of Frederick II. This was a court that was famously scholarly, but also multicultural. Adam's text relies quite a bit on Ibn Sina's canon in some parts, but as an early example of regimen literature is also quite distinctive. The text itself is divided into 3 main books, preceded by a short prologue. The first book reflects on the end of the journey. The first book is the regimen part of the text. The second book deals mostly with fatigue. And the short third book is the one that reflects on the end of the journey and the correlations between spiritual and physical health. So examples of preventative healthcare appear quite frequently through this text, as Adam writes, because it often happens that travellers, compelled by some convenience or necessity, must endure hunger or thirst or the discomfort of heat or cold, and it's necessary to provide remedies against these inconveniences as much as is illness and disease. So the advice is also very much framed around the idea that physical movement or travel would impact on health in various different ways. Diet, what Galen had called the first instrument of medicine, is a good example of how prevention and cure in this text are considered to be quite symbiotic. The text distinguishes between foodstuffs for travellers that are good medicinally and those that are just good to eat. And it says that some things should be avoided, being more necessary for medicine than for diet, such as fruits, vegetables, and other medicinal substances. For if they are thin, sharp, acrid, bitter, or sweet, they burn the blood during the exertion of travel. But if they're heavy, they produce thick humours and cause heaviness in the limbs. He also recommends or advises against foods according to location. And of course, the location of the crusader or the pilgrim, as with any traveller, changes obviously during the course of the journey. He says fresh figs, ripe grapes and dates are more nourishing in their native regions, so that these might be good to eat. But foods that are salty, fried, dry or roasted, as well as all phlegmatic or cold moist foods, and he gives the example, as you can see here, of scaleless fish, especially those from muddy or marshy waters, certain vegetables and melancholic items like cheese should be avoided. Especially sharp and drying ones, he says, like garlic and mustard and vinegar, and anything seasoned with vinegar and salt too much. All of these should be avoided by anyone undertaking a journey. Noting, however, that travellers, particularly perhaps soldiers, sometimes just don't have a choice about what to eat, he offers some very specific advice too. He says if it does become necessary to eat harmful foods, they should be used infrequently and not often, mixing them with substances of opposite nature. So here we have obviously the idea that balance is important in diet. However, if fruit is eaten, he says, afterward one should vigorously walk, exercise, or eat foods that promote evacuation, such as the water from cooked gourd with added honey, which loosens the bowels. So the idea of sort of mobility within the body, if you like, and motion as being influential on good health is important here. Following to the principles of humoral medicine, Adam of Cremona is similarly careful to individualise dietary advice, and you can see on that second quote on the slide here that he says many factors influence somebody's diet, including the person's constitution, age, habits, region, social status, time, mood, excitement, wakefulness, sleep, worry, work, leisure, rest, emptiness and fullness, all of those things. And he distinguishes between individual kind of constitutions or internal composition. If a person's constitution is warm, the season is cold, sleep is deep, they're experiencing joy, happiness and physical activity, then they should eat, as he says, a coarser or larger diet. But if the constitution is something different here, and particularly interesting, distressing mental states, if someone's suffering that, or if the person is fasting or overly full, then the diet needs to be milder, more gentle, more subtle, as he says, and reduced. Adam of Cremona is also especially careful to remind travellers of good water. And of course, we've heard quite a bit about this over the course of this conference. For him, water is good if it is subtle, clear, light and bright from eastern or northern sources running strongly over stone or earth free from contamination. He has a long section on how to purify water, and you've got the quote from that here, which is obviously a very useful instruction for soldiers in difficult or unfamiliar environments. And he tells them that if the water is too cold, it should be sipped or applied to fire. If it causes bloating or slow digestion and so on, if it's thick or cloudy, then it has to be diluted or boiled before drinking. He advises about substances that might correct bad water. You can see here the example of leeks, I think, and onion, or leeks and garlic. He says lettuce with vinegar is suitable for this purpose. Drinking mixed wine after them corrects their harmfulness or removes harm. He mentions theriac, which I'll get back to in a minute. And he advises the traveller on how to purify and distill water, as you can see there, through bark or cloth or breadcrumbs, and then dried. And he talks about the refining of water with rose water or with clay applied to boiling water, which is supposed to remove all bad qualities, especially if dried in the sun. It destroys all its harmfulness. So I was particularly interested to hear Rose talking about the clay vessel for perfume in this regard, the sort of clay materiality being a significant kind of mediator of health. So there's a combination of dietary advice, preventative healthcare, and I've just given those two very brief examples, and suggestions also for remedy here. So it's a text too, which I think is a nice illustration of the blurring of the boundaries sometimes between those categories. We also know that in terms of medicines, Crusaders took various items with them on crusade as prophylactics. Adam of Cremona, as I said before, mentions theriac, which was also a cure for snakebite. And he mentions often items like rose water and wormwood for chewing to alleviate nausea, particularly on the journey, and particularly in sea journeys. And those sorts of supplies were listed as essentials in a later manuscript, also directed at Holy Land Travels, anonymous author, which also listed good theriac powder for seasoning, constrictive powder, laxative powder, green ginger, roses conserve, and sugar as things that travellers to the Holy Land should take with them. And you can see here on this longer quote the other items of food there. Also here, you have the interesting sentence at the end of this quote about having taken care of all of these above, the sort of physical aspects of preventive health for a traveller. A pilgrim or crusader should go to confession, and therefore when he enters a ship, then he'll be led to the heavenly or the earthly Jerusalem. in good health. Adam of Cremona's text also recommends remedies for conditions likely experienced by soldiers like thirst. So you can see here that he recommends that various syrups could be used to fend off thirst, mixture of honey and vinegar. And he talks about different kinds of thirsts here, differing amongst the healthy, the sick, etc., etc. And he says that thirst that arises as a result of travel is particularly to be warned against. He recommends drinking sour and bitter liquids as being very effective at restraining heat and thirst, as he notes. And he also says that tablets made from sour milk and barley flour with butter, or taking oil from gourds, can prevent the harm of heat and thirst. So again, there's the idea that that travellers should be reasonably well provisioned with items, I suppose, to make these things, but also have the knowledge to be able to turn these into remedies. He warns against bad air again. We've heard a little bit about that, mixed with the vapours of swamps or lakes, or with the smell of corpses or filthy places. He says air will be completely bad. And he mentions a lot of environmental hazards, including lice and sore feet. And he spends quite a lot of time talking about sore feet for the traveller, advising that when someone has injuries, has suffered chafing or friction on the feet or other areas during a journey, and has maybe got blisters or so on, the area should be sprinkled with cold water and wrapped with linen soaked in rose water. And he has some other suggestions for onion water being beneficial for cuts caused by shoes, especially when mixed with goose fat, he says, as a lubricant. And then some slightly unusual suggestions from to heal abrasions from shoes, the lungs of rams, but also these other things. I was particularly interested to see red arsenic or realga, which I understand is also sometimes used as a topical remedy in other medical traditions. So if anybody knows anything about that, I would be interested to hear. So those preventative and curative healthcare measures all precede the very short third book of Adam's text, which reflects more specifically on the spiritual benefits of the Pilgrim and Crusaders' journey. Having previously discussed all of those things that seem useful or necessary for travellers to know about, he recognises that it's not enough for a traveller to have what the body needs without also understanding the right path they must take to ensure good health for them spiritually. So the right path, he says, is Christ's path, and he quotes the gospel, reminding the traveller that Christ is the way and the truth and the light, and those who follow won't walk in darkness. So the journey itself for him is a way of demonstrating faith or commitment to following Christ by taking this sort of right path, he says. And he also says that by taking up the cross and engaging in this particular journey, a traveller will also be kind of righteously enduring suffering. So for him, the bodily suffering is an imitation of Christ, but also a mark of the right kind of commitment to this physical journey. He also has the understanding that the more important journey that the traveller is taking is this interior and spiritual one, and he expresses this often in terms of purification, saying that the journey will purify the soul if the crusader eradicates the poisons of vice prior to the journey. And he very much emphasises the sort of purgative aspects of spiritual health care. And he talks about eliminating vice, eliminating sin, expelling evil, purging bad thoughts, that kind of digestive language is supposed to empty the body and soul of previous error and allow the crusader to start his journey with the right intention and the right purpose. Briefly, to try and stick to the time, during the crusading period as well, other sorts of pilgrims, not just crusaders, continued to travel to the Middle East. Sometimes they were restricted in their movements because of war, but they're often guided by local inhabitants and continually engaged as much as they could with holy sites and spaces. One of these is my second case study, which is a German pilgrim called Tietmar. We don't know too much about him himself, but we do know quite a lot about the two-part journey he undertook to the Holy Land, Sinai and Syria in 1217, 1218, so about 10 years before Adam of Cremona was writing his text. Tietmar wrote an account of this journey. It's a travel account. It's not an advice text directed at an individual like Adam of Cremona's regimen, and it doesn't contain explicit medical advice. But we can see in that text Tietmar being very concerned with both environmental and spiritual health throughout the account. He describes himself as embarking on the pilgrimage for remission of his sins, signed with and protected by the cross. It seems he wasn't actually a crusader per se, but his experience was inflected with the consequences of these holy wars, one of which broke out while he was travelling. Tietmar was especially keen to visit one particular site, the monastery of Our Lady of Sayednaya. At this monastery, I'll just go back to the map, you can see it right up the top here. It's about 20 kilometres northeast of Damascus. There was a painted icon that was said to have originally come from Jerusalem, which miraculously would become flesh-like and exude oil, which had particular healing properties. And this oil was collected by many pilgrims and visitors to the site, Muslims, Christians, and Jewish visitors as well, who kind of effectively shared the site as a sacred space, although sometimes access was a bit limited. The holy oil was of increasing interest to Western Christians during the Crusading period, and vials of it were taken back to Europe. And the oil was said by Tietmar in his account to cure blindness in particular, but it was also rubbed on the flesh or ingested to cure other debilitating illnesses. So the monastery of Sayednaya was quite distinctive in that the icon that dripped oil was of Christ's mother, Mary. So it was considered to be especially potent and particularly efficacious, both physically but also spiritually. On the right, you've got an image of the monastery, which is still standing, and another oily saint was St. Catherine of Sinai, a place where Tietmar also visited. In terms of spiritual healing, holy oil was continued to be deeply efficacious. Early Christian writers talked about oil as being important for pilgrims in particular, gave instructions about how to collect it, how to take it, and what to do with it. They would often bring home or travel with these ampulla, these little oil, these bottles for carrying holy oil or sometimes holy water, as you can see here, one from Jerusalem in the 12th century. The presence of oil in Christian thought and practices like pilgrimage obviously had a long history, but the early 13th century saw a real resurgence in interest in the nature of holy oil and the distinction between the use of oil by priests for sacramental purposes and oil used for healing purposes, including saintly healing. Oil had long been used for baptism and in ceremonies to anoint kings, but there was this new interest in how oil was used differently by priests and how it was used by saintly healers at shrines like Sayednaya. This is also connected to new interest in mystical spirituality, where the bodies of female saints in particular were represented as being especially fleshy and liquid. And as I said, Catherine of Sinai is another oily saint who represents that. But as I said, the Sayednaya icon, which you see here, wasn't just any old saint, it was Mary. And Mary was thought to have a unique humanity. She was fully human, but she was the Immaculate Mother of Christ. And increasingly, during the 12th and 13th century, she was thought to be someone who could work for the bodily and spiritual health of Christians in the afterlife as an intercessor, but also in their lifetimes as a healer. The oil that was said to come from the painted icon at Sayednaya, therefore, had very special spiritual properties. In Orthodox Christianity, two icons that exuded holy substances weren't that uncommon. This is not necessarily the same in the Latin West, but there were also at this time a number of statues of Mary in Western Europe that are said to become fleshly and even lactate when venerated by medieval pilgrims, and that these substances could be collected and then rubbed on the body or ingested for particular sorts of healing. And there's just a couple of examples here of animate statues of Mary represented in medieval manuscripts. And the famous
Professor Welch, can you please conclude in 5 minutes? Thank you.
Yes, I'm about to conclude now. So the holy oil that was said to come from the statue was preventative and curative. It could treat the particular affliction and the root cause of the illness. Sometimes the root cause was thought to be God's wish for a person to suffer. Sometimes it was a person's ill-advised actions and so on. Sometimes it was failure to see the truth of God. Sometimes it was to cure afflictions suffered by travellers. And the portability of the substance meant that it could be used for non-specified ailments too, far from the shrine itself, while retaining its special status proximate to the Holy Land. So, some concluding thoughts. I've sketched out those two examples just to show some of the complexities of medieval ideas of spiritual health. Ritual practices like pilgrimage and religious practices like crusading involve both inner and outward movement. That is, the mobility of the body on these religious journeys was mirrored by inner movement of the spirit towards God, as it was thought. Care of the physical body, like we saw in Adam of Cremona's text, wasn't independent from care for the spiritual dimension of a person's health or the health of a group. The power of the holy oil in Titmar's account demonstrates that symbiotic relationship between the physical body and the curative and eternally prophylactic nature of divine remedy. So together, those texts start to reveal that the dynamic and unstable body, physical and spiritual, might require constant attention, but that the mechanisms for securing good health were plentiful for medieval Christian travellers if they attended carefully to their regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Welch. Next, we have a paper by Miss Amrapali Sharma, and the paper is titled A Terrible Spreading Distemper, Daniel Defoe's Response to the Plague Debates of the 1720s. Ms. Amrapali.
Thank you, Dr. Tandon. Can I please have my PowerPoint presentation ready? Thank you. So before I begin my presentation, I'd like to say my thanks to all the presenters for the wonderful presentation, because this has been a very an experience of learning for me. And also many thanks to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present my paper here. Can I have the first slide, please? Yeah, so this is the title of my paper, A Terrible Spreading Distemper, Daniel Defoe's Response to the Plague Debates of the 1720s. Slide 2. My paper is in 3 parts. Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year and Due Preparations for the Plague, both published in 1722, were part of larger public interest in the disease that was generated by the Quarantine Act passed by the British Parliament in 1721, which was itself a response to a plague outbreak in France in 1720. Part 2, the second part, gives an overview of 2 contemporary theories on the transmission of plague. This helps in providing the theoretical context to Defoe's 2 works. In the third part, after a brief overview of Journal of the Plague Year, I'll speak about due preparations, which discusses preventative measures suggested by Defoe and his partial critique of the quarantine policy of the Walpole government. Slide 3, please. The British Parliament under Robert Walpole passed a Quarantine Act in October 1721 based on the recommendations of Dr. Richard Mean, who's the author of a short discourse concerning pestilence, again published in 1721. The act was passed as a response to a plague outbreak in France between May to October 1720, which killed nearly 100,000. It was feared that the plague could now spread to Britain with similar results, and it also brought back memories of the Great Plague of 1665. The city of Marseille in southern France was a major port between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. The common view was that commercial and naval ships had brought the disease to France and would now do the same in Britain. The English Act of 1721 had the following 3 clauses to safeguard Britain from the anticipated epidemic. The first granted the Privy Council the authority to issue orders for quarantine in times of any plague or infectious distemper. It ruled that ships, goods, and people arriving from infected regions be detained and subjected to inspection or isolation. In the language of the Act, it was, and I quote, lawful to and for the watchmen and other persons appointed to see quarantine performed to compel such persons, and that anyone found neglecting, refusing, or escaping would be guilty of felony. The second clause states that anyone who disobeys quarantine orders without proper license, including fleeing quarantine, resisting officials, aiding or abetting another in escaping, shall be adjudged guilty of felony and shall suffer death as a felon without benefit of clergy. Lastly, the third clause permits use of military or naval force to enforce the quarantine regulations and to cut off the communication between such infected town or place and the rest of the country, and to prohibit all persons, goods, and merchandises, whatever, to enter, pass, or be carried over such lines or trenches, and protects officers from legal consequences if deaths occur while executing these duties. The 1721 Act should be seen in the context of another Quarantine Act that was passed in 1710 by the Parliament under Queen Anne. That was in response to another plague scare from the parts of Eastern and Northern Europe, especially carried by ships from the Baltic region. Under the stringent provisions of the 1710 Act, ships traveling to and from British and Baltic ports were to be kept in observation for 40 days, a practice dating back to 14th century maritime port cities like Genoa and Venice and Italy. Interestingly, the word quarantine is derived from the Italian quaranta giorni, which means 40 days, isolation of 40 days of ships. During this period of detention, the cargo had to be unloaded and aired. Crew members and passengers had to prove their good health, or else they would have to isolate themselves in confinement. The 1710 Act had only laid down measures for port cities engaged in foreign trade, including forcibly confining passengers and crew in designated camps in near port. But the 1720 Act added measures applicable within mainland Britain, such as prohibition of commerce with any infected region in the country for a year, and the creation of lazarettos, pest houses, and quarantine camps for the diseased. It also included the French use of the cordon sanitaire, that is, boundaries or trenches guarded by soldiers and militias around villages, towns, or cities suspected of being infected. The 1721 Act differed in that it allowed the use of capital punishment and other harsh penalties against violators who would now be seen as guilty of felony charges. These two acts show how differently the British Parliament of the early 18th century understood its own role during public health crisis, with harsh and legal provisions to ensure preventative action, even when there was only the fear of a plague outbreak. Slide 4, please. Slide 4. The period of 1720 to 1724 witnessed intense debates among medical professionals, policymakers, and general commentators over the nature of the disease, its causes, and the most effective means of prevention and containment. Debates also raged over the two principal theories of disease transmission, the contagionist and the miasmatic. The miasma theory posited that infection was spread by bad air and by foul smell or other environmental factors. If that was true, then it followed that human to human contact was not a vector of transmission, and sanitary measures would suffice for preventative purposes. It is to be noted that the miasmatic theory continued to influence debates around the cholera in Britain between 1830 to 1850s. On the other hand, the contagionist theory claimed that transmission occurred through direct contact with infected individuals or their belongings. If that was true, then trade within the kingdom and with other countries had to be stopped. Likewise, free movement of citizens also had to be curtailed with force. Contagionism therefore threatened free trade and a fundamental legal right to liberty that was enshrined in the British political imagination from the time of the Magna Carta. Nonetheless, these opposing views played a major role in shaping both public health policies and how both the state and the public reacted to the threat of the plague. The resulting anxiety sparked a wide array of opinions and responses reflected in the writings of physicians, clergymen, and learned public commentators such as Daniel Defoe. Defoe's position in the debate between the two theories of epidemics will now be discussed. He was a contagionist and recommended quarantine but with certain conditions. Slide 5, please. One clear difference between Defoe's two work is that of genre. The narrator of the journal was a certain H4, Henry IV, an uncle of Defoe's and a London tradesman. He was basically a saddler. It's a first person account of a commoner trying to make sense of the devastation caused by the plague outbreak of 1665, when Defoe would have been 4 years old. Additionally, the journal spends considerable time telling the reader about the dilemmas the author faced at the time and the resolute preparations he made to provision himself to remain in London and not flee the city. Slide 6. The journal uses the testimony of a first person narrator as a narrative strategy to produce verisimilitude and the immediacy of experience. Thus, the journal has been variously described as a pseudo history, proto novel, a novel written as a journal, and even the first historical novel in the English language. Slide 7, please. By contrast, due preparations for the plague is an impersonal, learned public document of some 200 pages, which uses what has been called the Royal Society rhetorical style to engage critically with contemporary medical authorities, including Dr. Richard Mead, to critique government policies and to recommend alternative approaches to the prevention and spread of plague. It is a multifaceted text that combines medical advice, spiritual exhortation, and even some storytelling. The work is divided into two parts: preparations against the plague and preparations for the plague. The first part is divided into A, general public and national preparations, which the author describes as very deficient, and B, particular preparations for persons and families of the citizens. The second part, which begins nearly 100 pages into the book, is, as the narrator tells us, the hardest part of the work by far, but of greater consequence. While the first set of preparations related to public measures or concerned dietary practices and a pharmacopoeia, the second set of preparations were deeply Christian. They called for introspection, sincerity, repentance at a time of national and personal calamity. Unlike some other commentators of the time who viewed epidemic as a direct sign of God's anger at man's sinful ways, Defoe supports a naturalist origin to plague, yet views it also as a reminder of human mortality and contingency. In the discussion of public health policies, due preparations critiques the prevailing parliamentary response to the plague scare. In his view, the Act of 1721 was based primarily on the means the French had adopted to contain the plague at Marseille, insisting it is unlikely to succeed in the British context. Rather, Defoe gives the example of the Great Plague of 1665 to suggest that when people are left at liberty, infection rates actually decline. And I quote, whereas if the people were left at their liberty, except as was practiced here in the time of the last visitation, viz., by shutting up houses known to be infected, I say, if the people were left at liberty, those that did flee at all would flee because they were infected and thereby save their lives, and likewise not carry the distemper with them when they went. Defoe recounts how European governments, including England and Holland, undertook extreme measures such as setting fire to ships that were suspected of carrying plague. Defoe advocates a nuanced approach to public health, recommending quarantine based on relocating sound individuals from plague ridden towns to isolated barracks. He warns that certain commodities, especially wool and cotton, can retain and emit poisonous effluvia, thus highlighting the importance of caution in trade during plague. Slide 8. Defoe also focuses on sanitation and hygiene. He emphasizes bodily evacuations, regular cleansing, and the adoption of a strict, healthy diet long before any signs of infection appear. Defoe points to the plague in 1665 and speculates that overindulgence in food and drink may have exacerbated the epidemic. The government, he argues, should prioritize funding sanitation efforts such as cleaning drains over aesthetic beautification of the city. He likens the city to the human body, both requiring constant cleanliness and balance to remain healthy. One of Defoe's more controversial suggestions involves the use of mercury through a process called salivation to purify the blood. Though mercury was stigmatized due to its association with venereal disease treatment, Defoe maintains that gentle salivation combined with controlled diet, sweats, and mild exercise can prepare the body for plague. He stresses that these remedies must be applied before exposure. Once infection sets in, such measures are useless. Other preparations include destroying rodents and pests suspected of harboring disease and urging families to stock provisions and prepare for household isolation. Isolation and quarantine play a central role in Defoe's preventative model. Families must completely seal themselves off once the plague nears, even avoiding contact with neighbors. Defoe provides both anecdotal and historical examples of households that survived the plague through such measures. One is that of a wealthy London family that remained in isolation from July to December, having prepared itself by building water cisterns, sealing their windows, and using gunpowder for disinfection. Their only contact with the outside world was a porter named Abraham, who eventually died of the plague. The family also monitored the city's health through the bills of mortality, which were lists of the dead from each parish in London. Defoe warns against even walking in the streets and cautions that those who have recovered from the plague may still pose a risk. Although he supports household level quarantine, Defoe raises the ethical and political objections. He denounces the practice of quarantining healthy individuals with the sick as unsound policy and an invasion of personal liberty. In his own words, I shall not enter here upon the debate of the invasion of liberty and the ruin of property, which must necessarily attend such a practice as this. I mean, in case of investing towns. Forced containment not only destroys trade and employment, it also provokes desperate escape attempts, inadvertently spreading the disease, as was the case in France, where fleeing individuals caused new outbreaks. Defoe also targets contemporary literature on the subject, including a pointed critique of a 1721 book titled A Plague of Marseille Considered by Richard Bradley. He is particularly harsh on the anti contagionists, calling their views an ill grounded hypothesis. Defoe even uses the term animalcula to refer to the tiny invisible agents believed to transmit disease, anticipating the germ theory of the late 19th century. Quite in keeping with Defoe's Puritan dissenter belief, the second half of due preparation shifts from external public preparations to be made by the state and the citizens to an inward preparation for calamity and death. Defoe maintains that beyond physical preparations, the citizens must morally and spiritually prepare for death. He warns that death from the plague can come suddenly, often leaving no time and mental clarity for repentance. As such, he urges his readers to undertake spiritual reflection and moral reformation. Superficial or panic induced repentance, he cautions, is no substitute for sustained spiritual discipline. He argues that guilt and inner torment can lead to despair, which in turn may weaken the body's resistance to disease. He recounts examples of individuals who succumb to despair, suggesting that an unclean conscience a conscience can be as fatal as the plague itself. To illustrate the importance of spiritual preparation, Defoe uses the device of two short fictional narratives. In the first, a devout laboring class mother who repeatedly urges her sons to prepare their souls through repentance. Though they initially mock her, the growing threat of the plague forces them to confront their mortality. Similarly, a conversation between a pious sister and her skeptical brother charts a psychological journey from denial and jest to fear and repentance. One brother, after mocking warnings, is eventually overcome by terror, not merely of death but of divine judgment. After surviving the plague, the family holds a solemn thanksgiving, attributing their safety to both physical caution and God's mercy. Defoe's portrayal of this holistic preparation underscores his belief that true resilience comes from aligning bodily discipline with spiritual devotion. Throughout due preparations, Defoe presents a serious and occasionally alarmist tone. His message is clear: survival requires a dual commitment to physical health and spiritual vigilance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sharma, and thank you for finishing it just right in time. The last paper of the session is on faith and ritual in medical practices in India, reading a Dutch account on smallpox prevention in the 17th century by Professor Ishrat from the Aligarh Muslim University. So please.
I'll speak on that. Well, Madam Chairman, Professor Dr. Shivangini, and the organizing committee of this August conference, especially Professor Guy Gettner, Professor Farhad Hassan for bringing me to this. He is the only culprit. To participate in this international conference, which I must not hesitate from saying that it has benefited me a lot. Since last 2 days deliberations, what I found was that all the participants were raising the bar of expectation with each presentation. It was a pretty rewarding experience. Even just now, 2 papers were concluded. They have also given me some insights. My paper's title has already been announced, so I won't be spending time on that. I have divided my paper in 3 sections. First deals with historical notices of the incidence of smallpox in 17th century and early 18th century, in order to measure the scale in which this disease was afflicting the Indian population. Second is popular perception of the disease, taking us away from the textual evidence which we are getting. These are not based on medical text diagnosis, but they are based on on the experiences of the people who came into contact with one of the major Dutch traveler, Philip Baltius. He visited India around 1660 to 1672, and he has left behind very interesting piece of information for us to enter into a dialogue with that text. He has collected that information from miscellaneous sources. He is sometimes talking to the people, collecting information. And so these are some based on direct interaction between the author and the. He is also reporting from the place where for example, he is staying. People with whom he is interacting. In that way, it can claim that that information is based on primary sources. Of course, that is debatable, but these are, at the moment, we can claim that these are based on primary sources, and I'm pretty sure that the learner audience will, notice this from the few quotations I will provide. So this paper is partly based on my earlier note published in Deepak Bhai's book on disease and medicine. It is an elaboration upon that. So as the title suggests, that it is dealing with faith and practice. What I found was that in the beginning of the 17th century, this disease was quite rampant. In 1644, Antonio van Diemen reported that 600 slaves were taken from Coromandel Coast and Arakan to Batavia, out of whom 135 perished. They died. Only 465 could be taken to Batavia. And this kind of information we can, in one of my papers on slave trade, I have dealt with this problem, how they were dealing with the people who were getting affected by this disease on board the, on board the ship. So what they were doing was, and I'm surprised to know that, as Amrapali said, that they were already a practice that, if this disease affected any ship, then it will be quarantined for 40 days. But that was not in practice. That was, because when the European, especially the Portuguese and others, when the Spaniards and Portuguese, when they went to a new world, they carried this disease. They never quarantined. And same we find in the Dutch East India Company also. They are practical. Where will they stop and in the sea, So they were carrying them, and when they found that this is not manageable, they used to just throw, the patients into the sea in order to save the others. They were quarantining them in the, some of the cabins, but of course the surgeons were there, but we don't hear about any kind of, treatment being meted out to them. I don't know about this is in particular to the slaves. What was happening to the other Dutch people, that has to be taken seriously. When I was asking this question to you, sir, I had this in mind, what was they were doing, how they were dealing with the Dutch seafarers. They were officers, they were, servants and all. They were concerned with them. So that opens an area for us to look into. And as you had advised, that we should look into the journals, of the travelers who are traveling in those ships. If we could find any, they would enlighten us. Apart from this, in Mathura region, and this is based on Irfan Saab's work, he has noticed 25 villages as witness in the sale deeds. The personal descriptions were recorded before the Qazis, ranging between 1653 to 1717, and of them, as many as 10 had suffered from smallpox because their faces had pock marks. In the Cambay documents, later on we find there are reference to the incidence of smallpox in a document dated 29th November 1692, end of the century. There is a witness named Pasveer, son of Roop Karan, who had smallpox marks on his face. In another Cambay document of 24th February 1716, the description of the face of the witness, the hulia, is given, where the smallpox are very smallpox marks are very prominent. These two pieces of information I owe to Nadeem sir. Nadeem sir had given this to me, and that that goes well into my story. In 1718, the Dutch factors complained that due to the prevalence of smallpox, one cannot get. They are looking for indigenous bricklayers, and they are reporting that they are unable to get indigenous bricklayers to repair and restore the walls of the Cochin First, they call it, but that is Cochin Fort. That was so labor shortage is reported because of the smallpox. Possibly that section was, badly affected. Dr. Hahn reported that the prevalence of a strong, smallpox in Malabar. Similarly, it also affected the people of Punjab. In a sale deed of 1748 in the Batala documents, I found that both the two mortgagors, Gur Sahai and Karam Chand, they have pockmarked faces. 4 years later, by 1752, another document comes from the same town, Batala, where the description of a mortgager, Godaria, is given, who also bore pockmarks. A careful scrutiny of these limited number of documents, scattered and limited number of documents, does give us some information, some idea about the impact of this disease from mid 17th century to mid 18th century in the entire course. So in this context, the lengthy account that goddess of smallpox in Malabar region by a former Dutch reformed missionaries who was going to Ceylon should be analyzed. This account was considered so important by its writer, Philippus Valdius, that he wrote minute details of the disease, which I could find and translate. The very title of the chapter on it is quite interesting because it reads, Handling of the Daughter of Ixora. Ixora is Ishwara. Ishwar, the origin of smallpox. And you don't expect this to be there. This is, he's writing a text on the religions of India, where you find a chapter on this smallpox and its association with the goddess. Fear and service of Malabaris for this, robbing of their temple at Madiri by the king of Cochin, their arrival at Kolong. Philippus Valdius provides information about all these things, especially he's concentrating on smallpox and how the religious beliefs and rituals were responding to it. According to this Dutch account, there was a devil named Darida who, through his devotion to Brahma, got blessing that he could not be killed by anyone. Darida was overwhelmed by the powers given to him by Brahma, and with the thought of fighting Ishvara, reached Kalaya, where Ishvara resided. Since Darida had the blessing that no man could kill him, Ishvara sent a lady called Sorga, who cut off his head. Darida has his head restored by the blessings of Brahma. Then Ishvara sent 5 holy ladies called Chamundika by the Malabaris. They too chopped off Darida's head, but again he reappears. Next day, Ishvara consulted Vishnu what to do with him, and Patragali, that identifies as Bhadrakali, and the entire, I won't dilate upon this. The entire story goes that again he appears, and we are told that how goddess Patragali actually succeeded, and she got infuriated how she caused smallpox on the face of Ishvara because of this. According to the version, it was thus that smallpox was born. This is, a divine origin of a disease. Baldus is here narrating the history of smallpox in India as being interrelated with the goddess of smallpox, although both are obviously quite different things. This reflects the common practice of seeking and then interpreting a relationship between the disease and the divinities. However, it is clear from Baldius's account that the religious interpretations which the people of Malabar associated with the infectious disease did not exclude a naturalistic comprehension as well. Besides, divine. Baldius refers to, and this is very interesting because he is referring to, and on the first day, Deepak Saab was also referring to this, that he is referring to Greek and Jewish conception of the disease and compares them with the Indian version. He writes, I quote, the diseases under which smallpox should be reckoned, were sent by God to punish the sin of the humans. But she has natural causes. She can originate from within or from outside, as air, food, drink, sleep, waking, rest, and movements of the body, hunger, forcing, holding of excrements, fashions, and times of the year, winds, and venomous vapors of the air, as from the same scalding fever and pestilence. Baldus reference to the traditionally accumulated knowledge about the disease. He is saying that Brahmins also know well how, according to the size of the winds, each period of the year produces various diseases. So he writes, we found fault with this, with it in Ceylon Island, and especially in the kingdom of Jaffnapatnam, and in the province of Pachirpalli. How there is winter severe fevers and swelling up of bodies are caused by the saline and nitrous water, and how the mortality prevailing among their cattle is not unknown to them, how the itching eyes, especially in Malabar, tease the people, occurring from spoiled air, how very often the fish created by a stench of the water like mad and silly ones proceed to the beach and die in thousands, as few years ago happened in Amboina and earlier in Ceylon and other places where more such thing has happened. So it was not confined to only human beings; it was, affecting other, other, life things also, like fishes. Baldus also, this, smallpox on fishes are still reported. Baldus also described the seasonal pattern of the epidemic and its visits. He writes, so sees one in spring that Malabaris are attacked by smallpox, which without doubt originate from the heat and contaminated blood and from other various humidity and fruits, which the common people mostly partake, who also are attacked by smallpox for the reason, for the season is also considered deadly and remediable. After that, dampness was found to be responsible for it. This passage, sorry, I have some problem with my eyes. This passage suggests that during the spring season, the transmission of the smallpox virus was greater and shows a greater resemblance with the seasonal pattern of occurrence also in Bengal. Has been reported from Bengal as well. It is now known that the smallpox virus was more active and transmissible in dry weather conditions as well. However, Valdius's account suggests that a season in which there was dampness, then the people were more vulnerable to smallpox. As far as the medical treatment is concerned of the afflicted person, and this part is very interesting, how this entanglement with prophylactic, things, practices. Baldus informs us that some poxes were cured lightly, as against others which are deadly, which kill which kill the people in 12 or 18 days time, men, children, everyone. And the doctors, the Kumaras, doctors means the Brahmins and the Kumaras, they abandon these, those affected people in the country, and they don't treat them as such, because they are sure that they would die. The pagans, this is Vadius' observation, the pagans thinking that Patragali, since this disease, leave the patient at once. This can be the reason why the image of women is among the pagans. There a child strikes the poor on the neck as seeking help from from this idol being diverted by men because they judge the disease is infectious and sticking. They give the patient over to one of the Kumaras, being the devotees of Patragali, and it was believed that Patragali, since they are the devotees of Patragali, they have the cure. Believing that Patragali causes the smallpox, do then they do then many oblations and ceremonies for the sick to please this idol, cut off the heads of the one or two hens, animal sacrifice, and whose blood falling on earth was licked up by the dogs, not by the people. Elsewhere, too, he speaks about the worship and rituals associated with the treatment of the disease. Curiously enough, he speaks about Basuri. Basuri is the local term for this smallpox, who was considered to be the daughter of Ishvara. I will escape this. I should rather concentrate on other aspects. Interestingly, how the common people were reacting to this disease is also referred to him. Interestingly, what I find is that an iconoclastic attitude was developing among the people. Whether we can call it rationality, I don't know, but they were trying to rationalize it. Philippus Valdius refers to some kind of counter ideology prevailing in Malabar about the disease. They had started rationalizing the causes of its eruption. The entire passage in which he is telling us, I quote, he writes, people believe that also this disease is not caused by Patragali because people, people have not sinned, especially against her. Then why they are affected? It appears because many Brahmana and devout Kumaras who are otherwise considered to be blessed by goddess Patragali, why they die of this disease then? People are questioning this, though they are in friendship with this idol. Many have, according to their own admission, sinned greatly against Patragali. This is, when he's interacting with the people, they are telling them him that why then they are admitting that they have greatly said many things against Patragali, and nevertheless, they do not die of this disease. Then, so why they are spared, and those who are devotees, why they are, becoming victims. Many die of this disease are known openly, and they have certainly not sinned against Patragali. Therefore, on the popular level, there is some kind of looking for other causes apart from the religious or divine explanation. Despite such a skeptical attitude towards smallpox, Baldius does not refer to any medical treatment of the patient. However, he refers to the diet that was prescribed. And on this aspect, since last 2 days we are hearing about, he says that patients were given kanji, that is well cooked rice, watery, but they were not forced to drink it. They were also treated with bleeding, purgation, and taking of cold food. The mortality rate was, of course, very high because of these such practices. He notices that he says that all these things are not able to prevent the mortality, which is affecting these people. I'm finishing. So no, and he is also talking about variolation. He says that he saw some people, they are eating food. If when the people who are affected by smallpox, their food is taken is partaken, and they are fed to others in order to develop immunity in them. So a kind of variolation is reported as early as 1660s. This is very interesting. And variolation continues even after arrival of inoculation. That is in my paper. Even after inoculation in the early 18th century by the few Brahmins of Banaras, this is a famous story. But variolation continues till what I could find is till late 19th century. So that practice could be dated back to late 17th century, and from there it continues to be an alternative, treatment for smallpox. Well, with this brief, presentation, I conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. So we had three very fascinating presentations, and I think we can sort of open the floor for question and answer and discussion. So do we already have questions? Okay. So I think we'll just take one question at a time, because otherwise then it becomes difficult for the presenters to remember the questions.
At least
So-
I won't remember.
Yes.
Inconvenient questions I will never remember.
So who do we have first?
First,
Rose? Oh, does anybody online have any questions? Nobody?
No.
Okay, okay.
Okay. Yes, Aman.
Fascinating session, especially Amrapali's paper on Defoe. I just had this comment kind of thing that while writing or while doing the research on this paper, did you by any chance had an opportunity to look at Camus' work on plague? And why I'm saying this is that even though Camus' work is a fictional work, it had a strong Defoe had a strong influence on Camus. So much so that the initial paragraph in the plague is drawn from Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. So and actually there is a kind of this thing that when he was in Oran suffering from TB, he got this idea of, but rather than concentrating on the illness itself, that what the Defoe actually concentrates on, he actually focuses on the imprisonment aspect. And lastly, just one related to this, that and also the fact that both of them, even though they are talking about plague, there's a difference, as you mentioned, about the morality aspect. For Defoe, it's a morality that is important, but for Camus, he goes beyond saying that we should not judge people, and the creativity actually comes up in such things. And just one final comment on this thing only. In fact, the interesting thing is that when the COVID happened, it was Camus' book which was actually the bestseller, became a bestseller because people could relate with it more rather than Defoe's work. So
interesting.
Yeah. So Daniel Defoe is mostly known for Robinson Crusoe. Everyone is most familiar with his, Roxana, Moll Flanders, and other works, not due preparation. And that's why this becomes of importance to my for my paper and for my thesis in general. Um, with regard to Camus, I have read it. Yes, he does talk about plague in literal sense, but more in metaphorical sense as well. So I've read the book, but not, this is not really a part of my paper and thesis. This is much later.
actually consulted these two books of Defoe,
Okay.
which are very important for
Uh-huh. Thanks for your comment.
Thanks for all the beautiful papers which were presented in this session. But I would like to, I don't know whether it's a comment or just an open thinking, that when you talk about Chechak, there's smallpox, as you rightly pointed out, that there are a large number of documents which mention the presence of pockmarks. For example, the sale deeds in Hebanabas, both from Gujarat, which my friend Farhat Hassan and we have seen, as well as from Batala documents and others. But then apart from that, we also have those, hulias,
Yeah.
which are given in the, salary documents. Whenever a salary is to be made to a horse band, There's a hulia which is written,
Hmm.
and in a large number of them,
That's I didn't see.
the Chechak mark is given. Right. So in a way, I agree with you that Chechak or smallpox was quite prevalent as far as the medieval centuries are concerned. But then most of these informations which we are taking into account are based on Cambay and Ahmedabad and Malabar. So was it that this disease was more in the coastal areas rather than in the mainland of the Mughal Empire? Or was it equally present? Because in Batala documents, the prevalence of Chechak Dagh is much less than what we get in Cambay and other documents. Number one. Number two, what intrigues me is that all these Chechak marks are reported on the so-called common people, the working classes, indigo workers, merchants,
Bricklayers.
bricklayers, and so on and so forth. But as far as the higher echelons of the Mughal society are concerned, there's hardly any one case which is reported. I mean, we find reference to, for example, in their documents that their chehra is gandumi, or it is, I mean, of this nature or that nature. An eye is not there, or something else, or the crooked nose is there, but hardly any reference in the elites as far as the Mughal society is concerned of Chechak being there. So is Chechak prevalent only in the coastal areas, number one, basically? And number two, does it not ravage the so-called elites of the Mughal society?
Thank you, Nadeem. No, I didn't look at the salary documents. But whatever, we have very scanty information. The nature of the information is very limited. So whatever limited information we have, they are scattered across India. So one story could be that, it was widely prevalent. And by nature also, it affects wide people, number of people. It was almost an epidemic because till 1960s this was there. In the 1970s, the last case was reported only in 1971 after Bangladesh war. That was the last case. Since then, I don't know where it is dormant. It might reappear. We never know. The other question, which you are putting forward is very intriguing to me also, because in none of the paintings we find them. Nowhere. In the documents, I have limited knowledge of that, so I can't see that. But mostly it is the common people, lower sections of the people or the disadvantaged sections of the people who were affected lightly. And they were dying in a very short time, 12 to 18 days.
Khurram contracted smallpox. Neha Begmani is pointing out that Khurram
Acha.
contracted.
So that's a good information to us. Thank you very much, Neha. You have answered on my behalf to Nadim's question. Yeah. Take the mic.
Could it also have been that the sources do not speak about it because there was a sort of regarding the elites of the Mughal society, there was a removal of those references, or there was some sort of a social uh, castigation of those references.
But Neha has answered that question.
Yeah,
He's saying that it is reported.
but that is only one case. If we think of a larger,
We expect, that upper echelons of the society might have been affected.
so for example, the Masirul Umrah, I don't know how many references one would find.
No, there's
No
no,
reference.
So it's a very
no reference.
We deals with biographies of these people. We don't find any information. No, no.
Painting or something that you want to sanitize the thing.
That could be.
Khurram's reference also.
That's the problem, you see.
But Professor Alam, you just referred to Bhadrakali and how she was worshipped as a goddess for smallpox. In case of North India, there was a parallel of Shitla Mata also.
Yes.
So if a goddess has been venerated, she has been created and she has been worshipped by the masses, so it can't be a scanty reference ki without having mass scale contagion, nobody would bother to create a goddess or conceptualize a goddess because this evidence of Shitla goes back to the Puranas.
Yeah.
So, don't you think that it must be very much a phenomena in North India also, at least among the masses?
Well, Saurabh, in my presentation, I told you, that you let us enter into a dialogue with these kind of documents and then make out a picture. Otherwise, these are all tentative, So at the moment, we are confining ourselves to our documents. That's all.
I have a question for Megan, just to see if I can push you gently outside of your comfort zone. One of the themes that we've been experiencing in the last couple of days is about a lot of mutual learning, especially here in the subcontinent. I'm curious if when you're reading your documents, is there any sense of pilgrims, and let's use the broadest, the broadest term possible, but are pilgrims learning from other pilgrims, in particular Muslim and Jewish pilgrims that are visiting potentially similar sites or intersecting in similar itineraries and similar environments, and in terms of their own prophylactic and environmental care?
Can I just add to that question?
Yep.
Yes, Professor Welch, just as a follow-up to what Guy asked. So actually, I was interested in knowing that, and thanks for a fascinating paper, and this 13th century regimen that you mentioned. So do we have any idea that, did it become a blueprint for the later pilgrims and crusaders as well? Because as you rightly pointed out in your paper, this regimen was very, very detailed as to what to consume, what not to consume, etc. So, did it create a blueprint for the later crusaders and pilgrims? Thank you.
Okay, thanks both. So to answer Guy's question first, yeah, there is some evidence that that pilgrims, broadly understood, did learn from local inhabitants of other faiths and other travellers, particularly those pilgrims who benefited from the wisdom of local guides. So quite often access to pilgrimage sites throughout the Holy Land and beyond were a bit inaccessible because of conflict. And so local guides were actually quite important for pilgrims to be able to continue to get access to these sites. And in some of these travel accounts, like Titmar's account, not so much the Adam of Cremona one, but in cognate texts like that, you quite often have the information that somebody has benefited from having the local guide who showed them where the best source of water is, or pointed out, which fruit is good or bad, or like that kind of thing. So, there's never as expansive a text as you would want, but there's sort of plenty of hints in quite practical ways that that travellers did actually learn from those in the region. In relation to the second question, Adam of Cremona's text was directed to probably the elite of the elite. In other words, it was written for an emperor, Frederick II. So it actually had quite a limited circulation. So it was not a text that was copied many times, that survives in many manuscripts, that would attest to its sort of broader application. And in some ways, some of it's a bit quite derivative. You would have all recognised some of the Galenic principles and advice in some of the things. So it wasn't a text that I think nobody ever knew about, because it was produced in a court context, we think, so that at least that sort of courtly environment would have known about it. But in terms of becoming a blueprint for regimen literature, That one probably not so much, but the kind of accretion of that sort of genre, I think, through texts like Adams, create, I guess, the beginning of that regimen literature, which becomes much more sort of central to medical advice in the later Middle Ages.
Thank you, Professor Welch.
Sure.
Does anyone have any question, or should we break for lunch?
Just one small announcement that after lunch we would have like a roundtable open discussion on dementia and mental health, and you're all please participate. Yeah, and concluding discussion led by Professor Guy Geltner will be afterwards, after that roundtable open discussion.
So thank you all the three presenters for a wonderful session, and thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, but-
So